I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in terms of the cultural phenomenon around these drugs. They're going against the regulations and actually potentially endangering patients. But I just feel like the kind of misinformation around them is extending even to some of the medical professionals who are prescribing them. As a result, more and more people are now getting ill. I think there's now been 82 deaths in total linked to these drugs in the UK.
Ellie Flynn, welcome to PoliticsJOE. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I should have said welcome back because you were on here last year with Ed Campbell to discuss your Vinted documentary.
I was. Yeah, was it last year? Was it? Yes, it would have been last year now. I've lost track of what month it is. So thank you for having me again.
So welcome. Your new documentary is at Channel 4 Dispatches called Britain's Skinny Jab Scandal, and it's available to stream now. What is the top line? How would you describe what this documentary is about?
So basically, we take a look at the world of weight loss drugs and how easy it is to get hold of them. And we wanted to look specifically at kind of more official ways of getting them. So high street pharmacies, medical professionals selling them, and see how much they're following the regulations and whether people are still able to get hold of them who aren't supposed to be. And yeah, we found that was very much happening.
Before we get a bit more into that, I feel like Ozempic, Manjaro, Wegovy, these have all they became so ubiquitous and they really did just become a kind of cultural phenomenon overnight. When did you first become interested in covering Ozempic, and when did you first start noticing it kind of coming into the cultural zeitgeist?
Yeah, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in terms of the cultural phenomenon around these drugs. I probably first became aware of them a good few years ago now. Like a lot of the tips I get, it actually came through my hairdresser who had heard about people using these weight loss drugs. And I think at the time they were only licensed for people who were diabetic, but word was getting round that you were able to use them for weight loss. Since then, they've obviously been licensed for weight loss, and it's just kind of catapulted into this kind of crazy demand for these prescription drugs. As I say, unlike anything we've really seen before. But I think, I first heard about it probably 5-6 years ago now, and have been following ever since the sort of rise of interest in them and how much conversation there is around them.
It feels sometimes there's even a bit of a bad faith speculation about which celebrities are on it, which aren't. Even in Westminster, there's so much gossip about which politicians are and aren't, and it's become like a real cultural movement, possibly away from the body positivity movement, which felt like really dominated much of the 2010s, and maybe back towards previous early 2000s ideals of beauty. And I wonder if, when you were making this documentary, if that's something that you were thinking about or aware of.
Yeah, definitely. It's something I'm really conscious of, and I think it's one of the biggest issues around these drugs. And I think that, it's important to state these medications are amazing for people who need them. They absolutely do have a place. Like, I think I've spoken to so many medical professionals now who say that these are game-changing, revolutionary for people who are suffering from obesity and related health conditions. It's, they haven't actually ever had anything like this. So there's, this all comes in the context of like there's an absolute place for these. But what we're seeing is a huge side market, the private market, where people are trying to get their hands on these drugs or are getting their hands on these drugs, and seeing them as, I think, an aesthetic choice as opposed to a medical choice. And yeah, a lot of the language that you see around them on social media specifically, when people talk about kind of like Ozempic figures or Ozempic transformations or Ozempic face or whatever it might be, it feels like there's this new ideal of what women and men, and to be fair, I think it's interesting because typically women are the ones who are most affected by these sort of body image ideals, and who are most often sold these kind of products. But actually, I've seen as many men taking these drugs and desperate to get these drugs as women. So it really has become this kind of widespread cultural phenomenon. And I think that it's pushing these sort of beauty standards and this idea of what we're meant to look like, and what a great figure is, in a way that I don't think we've really seen since the 90s. And, there was this real pushback against 90s diet culture, and against the things we saw in magazines and what was perceived to be a perfect body. And it feels like we've come full circle and we're back there again. And interestingly, a lot of people who have been proponents of the body positivity, kind of industry or movement, you're now seeing talking about their weight loss journeys. And I think it's difficult for people to reconcile sometimes.
It's interesting because I guess one of the things that has been really interesting about Ozempic and celebrities is how many celebrities have been really open about their use of Ozempic. I mean, and male celebrities as well. The documentary begins with Robbie Williams on the Graham Norton show talking about how he has used Ozempic and he had really positive experiences with it. But like you said, it is often celebrities that aren't diabetic that we know about, or that aren't severely obese, and it's like you're saying, it's becoming like a cosmetic drug almost. But I wonder, how much do you think that celebrity openness around the drug and also our social media feeds are driving the demand for drugs like Ozempic amongst kind of everyday people?
Yeah, this is something I feel so conflicted about, because absolutely it's driving the demand. I think when people open up their social media and they see someone who's lost a lot of weight saying how amazing they feel, how, showing off their body, and people are commenting on that post saying, wow, you look great, you look amazing, and people are kind of, giving credit to this weight loss, and then they say, oh, I've been on these jabs, I've done them for however long, it's changed my life, then of course that's appealing to their audiences, both because you're seeing the praise for the weight loss, and then also because this person is influencing you to think that it's an amazing thing. So I think that there is a responsibility for people with platforms to be conscious of that. The flip side is, I also think it's problematic if people, celebrities, influencers, are using them and not being open about that. And, you're having the same impact of seeing someone lose a huge amount of weight, look a certain way, people are telling them that, they look amazing, and then they lie about how they've, how they've manage that weight loss. So on the one hand, I think it's good when people are open and honest about it, and I think that being frank with your followers is important, and that authenticity is important. But the flip side of it is that it's fueling this huge demand for these drugs, which can be at times dangerous for people who don't need them. And I think, sorry, just to add to that, it's the other part of this, which is spoken about sometimes, but I think sometimes not considered massively, is the impact it has on people with a history of disordered eating. And I think that that's something that we need to be really, really conscious of. The language around these drugs and the glorification of them, I think, can be really triggering for people who've suffered with that in the past, or are suffering with that.
That's really interesting. I mean, that's not something that's even, luckily enough for me, that's not something that even crossed my mind in this whole conversation. But that you think that the glorification of these drugs is harmful and detrimental? I think
it can be for people. Yeah, I think when you are seeing celebrities or influencers, or even just people people on social media, talking about the way that it makes them feel about food, the way that it makes them look, and having so much emphasis on their body and the way that they've achieved this certain look, that is going to be triggering for people who either are suffering with or have previously suffered with disordered eating. And I think that sort of normalising those conversations, especially when we're talking about people who are not eligible for these drugs, people who are of sort of normal, healthy weight, I just think we need to be really, really careful.
Your documentary investigates the private prescription of these drugs. Who are the private providers that we're talking about? And can you tell us the rules and regulations that pharmacies should be following before handing out drugs like Ozempic?
Yes. So you can get prescribed these drugs. There's two ways of getting these drugs. You can get them through the NHS in very limited circumstances. So not every NHS trust or every NHS hospital will prescribe these drugs, and the ones that do prescribe it to people often who have a BMI of over 35, often have other health conditions that are impacting them, and sometimes I have some form of diabetes, because you can also be prescribed these drugs for diabetes. So you can get it on the NHS, but it's quite difficult and not that many people do. The other way to get hold of it is on the private market. And essentially anyone who has the money, and they're quite expensive, that we found them for about £180 every 4 weeks was the cheapest that we found.
Wow.
Yeah, that was the cheapest we found in kind of the pharmacies that we looked at and with the nurses. So it's an expensive thing to be doing. So the General Pharmaceutical Council, which regulates all pharmacies in the UK, brought in new regulations about a month ago. And those regulations have tightened up the prescribing process for any pharmacist. So now they say that you need to have a face-to-face consultation, you need to see a photo ID, and you need to be basically properly verifying the height, weight, age, suitability of anyone that comes looking for these drugs, if you're going to prescribe it in a pharmacy. Those regulations were not as strict when we started this investigation. So the photo ID element is something that's new. We wanted to test how easy it is to get hold of these medications, even if you're not eligible. Mm-hmm. So we looked specifically at pharmacies, whether underage patients would be able to get hold of them. So we looked at all of the kind of major high street chains, and we found that Boots was the only one that wasn't asking for photo ID. So we put their system to the test. We got an underage undercover reporter to apply for the drugs, and she put in all of her real details. So she put in her real name, her real address. She even put in her real GP surgery, because they say that as an additional safety measure, they're going to check. They're going to check in with your GP. So all of those details were correct. And the only thing she lied about was her date of birth. She put in a different date of birth that would have made her 18. She was actually 16. And she was prescribed the medication in about 4 days. And we spoke to a pharmacist after who said that it would be so easy to check those details. You put someone into a database and you would see that their name, their address doesn't add up with their age. So it suggests that perhaps those checks weren't done. Also, we got our reporter to check with her GP, and she says that her GP was never contacted, even after she'd put the details in. So it suggests that there's a few separate failings in terms of things going wrong when it comes to prescribing these. And we retested the same situation after the regulations were changed, and we had the same outcome. She was able to get hold of the drugs.
It's scary how easy it is for someone under 18 to access, who doesn't need these drugs, to access them. And that's through private pharmacies. Like, you can only imagine how easy and how big the market is for it unregulated. What are the sort of side effects of taking drugs like this when you don't need them?
So side effects can range from, sort of discomfort, gas, stomach cramps, nausea. They're sort of the most common side effects that people might see. A lot of people will say they'll be quite mild and won't last too long and should settle as you kind of get used to it. In more extreme cases, though, you can see things like pancreatitis, increased levels of acid in the bloodstream. And that's something that we spoke to an A&E doctor about, who said that in the summer she was seeing a patient come in every day with complications related to these drugs. And most often those patients were patients who wouldn't have been eligible for them, who'd managed to get hold of them on the private market, either by falsifying their details or, as you mentioned, through a black market, which is a whole other side of this that we don't look at in our documentary, but is a massive problem.
Mm-hmm. I guess the other side of this is that you do explore in the documentary is how private prescriptions of these weight loss drugs have led to a two-tier healthcare system. What does that mean, and what are the consequences of that? Yeah,
so as I said at the start, these, for all of the issues around kind of people getting their hands on these drugs who don't need them, these drugs absolutely do have a place. And for people who really do need to lose weight, and who really struggle with sort of food noise, and are at risk, quite honestly, because of their weight, these drugs can be genuinely life-saving. We speak to people in the film who say that they feel these drugs are saving their lives. They've been told by their doctor that they were at risk of huge health complications as a result of obesity, and this is the only thing that's ever worked for them to help them lose weight. So essentially they are great for the right people, but they're really expensive, and so that means that the NHS isn't able to prescribe them as readily as perhaps they would like to. So it comes down to individual NHS trusts, basically, and integrated care boards in order to decide where their funding goes. And as part of that, they will decide, who they're going to prescribe these drugs to and if they're going to prescribe them at all. So the NHS guidelines are they will prescribe them for people, or the NICE guidelines for the NHS are that they can be prescribed for people who have a BMI of over 35 and or lower if they have another health condition. And so that's what some boards have introduced, but not every NHS board is prescribing them because, for budgetary decisions. So we asked all of the 42 integrated care boards in the UK, who are essentially in charge of deciding where NHS funding goes, if they were prescribing these drugs in each of their areas. And we found that 4 health boards and 4 hospital trusts weren't prescribing these drugs at all. So that means that in parts of the UK, even if you desperately need it, you can't be prescribed these on the NHS, and so your only option is to go private if you can afford it, but as I've said, they're expensive. On the flip side, you have this secondary market, the private market, which is really easily accessible as long as you've got the money. So you end up with what one doctor describes as a 2-tier health system, because people who desperately need it, whose lives would be saved by it. I mean, we meet someone in the film, a woman called Anne. She's suffering from stage 4 endometrial cancer. She needs surgery to remove the cancer, surgery which would be life-saving, but she is unable to go under general anaesthetic, unable to have the surgery because of her weight. It's too risky. So she needs to lose the weight in order to have surgery to save her life, but she can't be prescribed these drugs on the NHS and she can't afford them. So she's in a situation where she's quite literally at risk of dying unless she can get her hands on these drugs. Meanwhile, you have people who are getting seriously ill from complications because they're taking them when they don't need them. And it just feels like the balance is completely off.
I mean, one of the things that really stood out to me in the film is that there are people advertising themselves as NHS nurses to do private prescriptions, but I guess the film is kind of getting at that it's leading people into maybe a false sense of security about these private prescribers. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. So we found a number of nurses we found lots of nurses were selling these drugs on the side, and some of them work for the NHS and were selling these drugs on the side of their NHS roles. And we found that a number of them were doing so without doing the proper checks. So we had 3 nurses send us medication in the post after we filled out an online consultation. One of them asked us for a video consultation, but didn't do anything to verify our reporter's height or weight or BMI when she was on that call. The reporters that we used were both well under the BMI. So on the private market, you need to have a BMI of over 30 in order to be eligible for these drugs, or 27.5 if you are from a BAME ethnic background, 27 if you have some relevant underlying health conditions. But our reporters didn't fit that criteria in any case. And they were sent them in the post. One reporter did a video call and no questions were asked. And then we went to 2 nurses in person to see if kind of being confronted with someone who was quite clearly, a healthy weight and didn't need these drugs would stop them from prescribing them. And both those nurses prescribed them to our reporters. One even commented on the fact that she only needed to lose a few pounds. And I think that it's tricky because on the one hand, I think that there's obviously a financial incentive in selling these drugs. There's a massive market for them. It feels like lots of people are trying to cash in on the gold rush around these drugs. But I don't think that the nurses were only selling them for kind of financial incentive. I feel like even they are caught up in sort of some of the misinformation around this. And I think that there was perhaps a naivety that like actually, you know, these are great and they've seen so many people have great experiences, or they might have actually used them and thought they were great, and so they feel like they're helping people even though they're going against the regulations and actually potentially endangering patients. But I just feel like the kind of misinformation around them is extending even to some of the medical professionals who are prescribing them, and that to me just feels, you know, quite mad.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess on social media you never see any of the downsides of these drugs or the side effects that your documentary explores. So I guess it's very easy to just get caught up in this is a sort of miracle drug and there's no downsides to it.
I feel like there is so much misinformation around these drugs, and that's something that I really noticed in the period that I've been looking into them. People just don't understand. They don't understand what they do. I don't think they understand who they're meant to be for. I think that a lot of people, if you ask them, you know, what is Ozempic, who can use it, I think they would think that anyone can use it. And it's like, oh, well, it's just, you know, it's a weight loss jab and you can buy it from a beautician or you can buy it from someone on Instagram. I don't think people see them as prescription medications. And I think they've been trivialized to such an extent that it's created this kind of mass misunderstanding, mass demand for them. And as a result, more and more people are now getting ill. I think there's now been, 82 deaths in total linked to these drugs in the UK, 22 linked to people who are using them solely for weight loss purposes. And you have to remember that these are relatively new drugs in terms of when we're talking about, they've been around for a while for treating diabetes, but when we're talking about using them solely for weight loss purposes, it's only been a few years. And so a lot of the medical professionals that I've been speaking to are concerned about long-term implications, how people get off them. You use it for a while, you lose the weight you want to, and I think it can be really difficult to kind of maintain those lifestyle changes once you come off. And just the impact that it is having on us culturally in terms of what we're now seeing as the ideal way to look and how you attain that.
Ellie Flynn, thank you so much for chatting to us today. And your documentary, Dispatches, Britain's Skinny Jab Scandal, is available to stream now on Channel 4.